Okay, hopefully this is a quicker one. So, we're going to talk a little bit about, I guess, quote, modern settings. Something I've run into, especially, running a system that's not designed for it, like running the SCP game and our upcoming Shadow in the Warp game. When firearms are such like a big part of a setting, like, in a modern setting, like the SCP game, or a futuristic setting, arguable, like 40K, firearms are like a default thing. They're just everywhere. Everyone has a firearm. But something about 5e as a system, it really not forces you, but really encourages you to, basically pick either strength or dexterity. Something I've sort of had an issue with as, like a really minor issue with as part of the system, whereas like, in the real world, your skill with a firearm is not governed in like by your dexterity. Your skill with a sword is not governed purely by your strength. That kind of stuff. Like, those two stats are not the end-all be-all of how competent you are with a weapon. Like, essentially, even in a medieval setting, like someone that has someone that like a mercenary that utilizes both like a long sword and a bow equally, like, they're going to have like roughly, if you wanted to put it into stat terms, they're going to be roughly like similarly invested in a real world, in both strength and dexterity, because both of those stats are important to utilizing weapons and anything else. What that really means is they're going to have like a +2 in both, and it should be fine. But for a player character's perspective, you want those numbers as high as possible to use the system appropriately and get the highest bonuses and blah, blah, blah. But that's stupid. So even in like the 40K game, like my character is, he's a dex-based space marine, but he's still using heavy armor because that's the way the system is kind of set up. And it's not really a problem, but and I feel like that kind of idea where you need like strength or dexterity, you can't use both, you can't use one in place of the other in most places, gets in the way a lot. Just a lot. And so one of the ways I fix that in the SCP game is the majority of firearms are finesse. You can just use both. It doesn't matter. Whatever your main stat is fine. And in some cases, it does make sense for a weapon to not be finesse. Something like a two-handed great axe. Probably not going to use dex for that, mostly because you're not going to build a character designed around that. Some sort of live dex-focused, like, dancer character with a great axe. Now, if a player came to me and wanted to do that, I don't see too much of an issue with it, and we could design something around that idea. But in general, so usually I approach it from like a case-by-case basis. The cleric in my SCP game has, low dex. I think it's just flat. It's just 10. But they use a submachine gun, and they're mostly melee focused, but they have a submachine gun. That submachine gun is finesse. Whereas the barbarian character has some ranged weapons. Guess what? Those ranged weapons are finesse. They can just use strength with their handgun. Well, I guess how do you justify that? Well, you could just leave it completely abstract, and it's kind of whatever. Like in the case of that cleric, it's just, okay, that's their main attacking stat. that's fine. It's whatever. Like it's just not an issue. It doesn't come up. It's a game abstraction. Or you could approach it more of a, like, from the barbarian's perspective, barbarian fighter technically, as more of a, these weapons are designed kind of specifically for this type of fighter, and they're very heavy and cumbersome. So they're just extremely powerful, but you need dex for them. So, like, that's kind of one way to go about it. But just kind of in general, in a system like 5e, I definitely feel the lack of, to use a Soulsborne term, quality stuff. Which, quality is just where you have a build where a weapon uses strength and dex equally. So I definitely feel like there should be more support for that, where, you know, you just have strength and dex, but it's also a quirk of 5e where your stats don't really increase that much, because, one, every opportunity you have to get stats, you also have to decide whether or not you want a feat, and feats are so interesting and powerful that it's usually a bad idea to go with stats, at least from a gameplay perspective, or not from a gameplay perspective, but like from a stuff you can do perspective. Whereas from a pure mechanic standpoint, you always want to increase your stat. Always. Because it's mechanically more powerful than almost any feat. Which is a problem because feats are fun. Which, one of the reasons, I think my favorite approach to stats and feats and stuff is the approach we had for my one friend Zia's Ugliest Man Alive campaign, where it was point buy to determine stats, and it was an improved point buy. And every ASI, we get both a feat and an ASI. Simple. There's no more choice involved, and you can't sub out like, oh, for my feat this level, I'll get this, and for my ASI, I'll get a feat. Like, no, you increase your stats by 2, and you get a feat. That's it. There's no, there's no choosing one or the other. I think that's overall my favorite, because it keeps the numbers going up the way the system is supposed to work, and it allows you to get a feat. But ultimately, at the same time, if your stats don't go up that much, it kind of doesn't matter. I'm not going to touch that too much. The main focus of this video is the fact that is, again, the thesis of this video, this short, like 10-ish minute video. If you have firearms in your system, in your setting, you're usually encouraged to go dex, which means you can't use, like, the fun longsword. So what do? I mean, like, actually, I don't know what's going on with the rest of the Space Marines in our Shadow in the Warp game, like, because we've got basically a ranger, a monk, a crusader, which is kind of like they're basically like a charisma fighter. They have some other stuff, but they're basically a charisma fighter, and a psyker, which is basically a wizard. I don't know, like, for the ranger and the monk, yeah, we got high dex. It's whatever. But I don't know what's going to go on with the what do you call it? With the Crusader. Like, what's their dex at? So how much are they going to be utilizing ranged weapons? But is the lower stat of dex, like, is their what do you call it? Their gun having only like a plus 8 to hit versus their sword having a plus 10, how much does that matter? Like, if you've got similar numbers in strength and dex, I don't think it's that big of a problem. But if you've only got, if you're in a situation where you have, like, essentially no dex, then I think it's a much bigger issue. It's, you know, it's a thing. There's certain ways to solve it, and they're not perfect, mostly because, you know, they're effectively hacks of the system anyway. So, I don't know. There's questions. There's lots of questions. But, yeah, that's all I got for you today.